I would say that you're seeing a rallying around the flag phenomenon. The question is how long that lasts. It's clear by now the US doesn't have that capacity. If it could potentially, if it invaded Iran, the idea that they would actually be willing to put 500,000 troops into the ground, there's just no political pathway to that.
When will this war end and how, if we were to speculate? Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz right now? What is the current situation? Can we expect a resolution to the Iran war by the midterms or even by the end of the year? We're going to find out what's next and analyze the current situation with our next guest, Trita Parsi, co-founder, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, and the author and founder of his Substack, tritaparsi.substack.com. Check it out, link down below. Trita, welcome back to the show. I don't think I've had you on since the start of the Iran war. Understandably, you've been very, very busy, so welcome back to the show. Good to see you again.
Great to be back with you, David. Really appreciate it.
Give us a rundown, just high-level overview of the current situation from a political and military perspective right now. Trump on Truth Social earlier this week posted that the U.S. has total control over the Strait of Hormuz. We'll put a screenshot of that on the screen for the audience to read as we analyze that. But is he right? Does the U.S. have total control through the naval blockades?
Absolutely not. We're in a situation in which the U.S. is not only stuck, but increasingly, it's clear the U.S. does not have any military options at all that can really work. We saw how the Trump administration restarted the war, bombed Iran for 13 days, and then ended up in a weaker position than it was before the bombing campaign had begun. The Iranians are blocking the strait. They are in control of who he goes in and out. At the same time, the U.S. has its own blockade, and they're stopping some of the Iranian ships. But the traffic through the strait is really significantly down. So part of the key problem that Trump wanted to resolve remains in place. I think Trump's tweets increasingly sound at that type of a frustrated Trump that is angry because he's not in control of the situation. Doesn't mean that the Iranians are in full control either, but they're not expressing their frustration as openly necessarily as Trump is. There is a way out of this, but that path is becoming increasingly narrow because confidence and trust that was never high in the first place, obviously, between the two countries, has now more or less been eliminated because of what happened with the MOU. The fact that that deal within a couple of weeks collapsed and you had the US go back to bombing Iran. That has made it extremely difficult to get back to a new deal.
Well, some elements of his post Truth Social are true. The Iranians have suffered a naval defeat. Their air force has suffered major defeats. Leadership at the IRGC have been decapitated, and there is really high inflation in the country currently. But all that to say, the U.S. Navy currently, or the military overall, cannot force the Iranians to open the Strait of Hormuz, despite the Iranians having no Navy, no Air Force. Why is that?
Well, going over some of these things, yes. Is there massive inflation in the country? Absolutely. Were a large number of Iranian officials killed? Definitely. Are the other IRGC fleeing? I've seen no reports of that. Are they not in control? On the contrary, they're in greater control of the country than they were before. I would go as far as to argue that this war may have in some ways saved the Islamic Republic, similarly to how Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980 attacked Iran at a moment where the revolution was very young and had not fully consolidated, but the war actually enabled Ayatollah Khomeini at the time to consolidate power and in some ways save the Islamic Republic. And we saw the massive protests that took place in Iran in January. And I think the theocracy was actually in a very, very a vulnerable position. The war in some ways saved it because that external threat enabled them to really clamp down internally, but also getting a rallying around the flag phenomenon that has put them in a very different situation now than they were a couple of months ago. Whether that is long lasting or not is a different story. But I think the manner in which this war really has backfired, it is frankly spectacular. So yes, the administration can list a lot of operational success, tactical success, but you don't win wars through tactical successes. You have to translate those into strategic successes. And we have not seen any of Trump's strategic objectives being achieved.
Do you think the Iranian people right now trust the current leader to run the country and resolve this issue?
Very difficult to say. We've seen no real polls. It's going to be very difficult in the midst of this war to conduct those. It's difficult under normal circumstances. I would say that you're seeing a rallying around the flag phenomenon. The question is how long that lasts. If this war goes on for much, much longer, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Iranians as well. The economic situation is very, very difficult. They have managed to ensure that there's food and other things available, but at the same time, this is taking a huge toll on the civilian population. And if we move into a scenario in which the population believes that the Iranian leadership is the obstacle to a solution rather than Trump, I don't think that's the perception they have right now. But if we move into that scenario, then it's going to also further reduce the government's ability to keep control or to believe that they have time on their side.
Have you spoken to any Iranians about how they feel about the change of government? From my understanding, most Iranians didn't approve of the previous Ayatollah's methods and political regime. And a lot of people actually wanted a regime change. We don't have a regime change now. There is a change of leadership, but not a regime change. So I don't know how polarized this situation is for the actual Iranians in the country. Can you tell us?
So yes, I've spoken to a lot of people, and including a lot of people who've traveled to Iran and out during this period. And I think, first of all, you're quite right. I think the overwhelming majority of Iranians wanted to see a different government in Iran, a different system altogether. The question has always been, how do you achieve that? And I think the elements that became so desperate that they actually fell for this idea that you could get a good regime change through foreign military intervention by Israel and the United States. First of all, I think they were a very small number, but I think a lot of them have come to the conclusion that that was quite a mistaken belief that they had. But I don't think the majority ever were in favor of war. I think people in the West have been given that impression because the media coverage, particularly of diasporas, and which even in the diaspora, it was never a majority position, but it was the position that was overwhelmingly platformed, just as much as it was back in 2003, when CNN and many of the other major outlets constantly paraded a series of Iraqi Americans who begged for Iraq to be bombed. But I don't know if they were a majority back then, but this time we do know based on polls that they were never a majority in the diaspora.
What do you
the
think?
question now is, of course,
Yes.
What are their views about the current government? And I think, again, because of this major distortion, which is that there's a war going on, and we've seen that in that war, the United States and Israel has hit critical infrastructure. Trump has called, threatened to destroy, wipe out an entire civilization. He has said that Iran's borders may change throughout this war. It's very clear to anyone who's willing to listen that this is not a threat to the regime. This is a threat to a country as a whole. So the narrative of the government in many ways have managed to become validated because of the conduct of Israel and the United States in this. And I think that has led to a scenario. Again, I think for now, it's a very different story if the current scenario ends up lasting 6 months from now or a year from now. If you take a look at, for instance, last summer, there was a major rallying around effect when the Israelis started bombing Iran. 2 months after the war, it was more or less gone.
Before we continue with the video, let's talk about a problem that comes with owning gold. Now, gold has long been treated as a store of value, but the catch is that sitting in a vault, it doesn't pay you anything. So that's where today's sponsor, Monetary Metals, comes in. They offer investors a way to earn a yield on gold paid in physical gold. Through their leasing platform, investors can earn up to around 4% annually with yield paid monthly in ounces rather than dollars. So your holdings are measured in gold itself, not in fiat currency terms. The gold stays your asset throughout, and it can be redeemed at any time. Thousands of investors are already earning a monthly yield in gold through Monetary Metals. So visit the link down below, monetary-metals.com/Lin, or scan the QR code here on screen to learn more and get started today. Do you think Iran has made a strategic mistake by attacking the UAE and Oman and threatening Saudi Arabia, alienating other Gulf states in this process?
I think, let me put it this way, I don't think the Iranians view that as a mistake at all. I think they believe that their horizontal escalation is part of the reason why the United States and Israel failed. In the case of some of these countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, there's plenty of evidence now that the United States was using their territory to conduct attacks against Iran, which then makes it very different. I don't think there's any such evidence that that was taking place out of Oman. Oman, of course, only has had a few hits. The UAE was itself involved in the war, so it's a different story. If anything, I think a lot of folks in Iran believe that they didn't strike UAE hard enough. And the Saudis were also largely spared, even though there was evidence that a lot of the American bases there were used, at least for logistical reasons, and the Iranians hit those bases as well. So I don't think you have a scenario on the Iranian side right now in which they think it was a mistake. Now, if you ask my personal opinion, I think that a very dangerous path the Iranians may go down is that if in their effort to, in their view, fight back against Israel and the United States, they come across as too much of a threat to some of these countries, then the post-war scenario may end up becoming a completely different type of a problem for the Iranians. So you see now, for instance, that Turkey, Saudi, and Pakistan have created this pact. This is primarily driven because they've lost faith, understandably, in the American security umbrella. But it would be very dangerous for the Iranians, I would say, if this ends up becoming an anti-Iran pact, which it only would if they are seeing Iran as a major threat. So the very same type of a policy of isolating Iran, which was driven by the United States for the last 4 decades, may end up becoming driven by some of these states. I think there's a high likelihood that this won't happen, but I'm saying that if the Iranians don't play their cards right and end up really cementing the perception that they are an uncontrollable threat, then you will see natural balancing against them.
Right now, last week, the Iranians declared that they won't negotiate with the White House until Trump is out. And they certainly won't reopen the Strait of Hormuz until their demands are met. Among their demands, war reparations of more than $300 billion and the complete removal of the U.S. military, just to name a few. Which of these demands are, in your opinion, most likely to be met? Or are the Iranians just playing hardball and coming here and expecting to meet in somewhere in the middle here?
So I think the picture is a bit mixed in the sense that many of these demands are actually part of the MOU. Some of them, of course, are added on. And I think that's exactly where it comes in which they're playing hardball. They're throwing out their wish list. And even their wish list is genuine demands that they have, but it's a demand that they believe must be achieved at the end of the negotiation, which is very different from saying it's a demand that needs to be achieved as a precondition for a negotiation. But I don't think we should have any illusion that as part of their demands, they will try to get reparations. I don't think they will succeed. If it happens, it will come through a completely different way. It will not be, the rubric will not be reparations. I do think that they want to see the United States leave the region. I think it would be somewhat counterproductive for them to push for that too hard at this point, because having destroyed most of the American bases, more or less, in the region, and having convinced the GCC states that those bases are not actually effective in protecting them, I suspect that the U.S. is actually going to withdraw from these bases anyways. And it may not do so if the Iranians turn this into a demand. But if it is up to the U.S. itself, it's not going to pay for rebuilding these bases. The GCC states are likely not going to do it either. So most of them, not all of them, will be abandoned anyway. It would be foolish for the Iranians if they turn it into a demand and then turn the administration into a position in which it feels like it can't do it now, because now it would be seen as a concession to the Iranians.
There have been now attempts to ramp up the development and building of pipelines, especially through the UAE, to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed until an alternative route by land can be built?
No, because I think that's going to take far too long. I think these things saying that it's going to take 2 years, I think, are very, very optimistic. But I think it's also important to understand it's not just gas and oil that comes out of these pipelines. It's also a lot of out of the Strait of Hormuz, out of the Persian Gulf. It's fertilizers, it's a lot of chemicals, etc. And a lot of those things you cannot put in pipelines. So the Strait of Hormuz is going to remain strategically important for a long time. Now, can the amount of oil flow in the world be reduced? Yes. In fact, I think it was 25 years ago, it was closer to 40% of the world's oil. It's gone down to about 21, 22%, but that's largely because Brazil is now pumping 5 million barrels a day, and many other countries are pumping more. The US is pumping more. So you've seen increase of production in many other places, which have in and of itself reduced the strategic importance of the Persian Gulf. I think that trend will continue. And I think you will see some other pipelines, but you will not be in a scenario anytime soon in which the importance of the Persian Gulf would just completely evaporate.
If Trump had to make a plan to force the Strait of Hormuz to open by, let's say, October, I'm just making this up, what would he have to do? And why is the U.S. not incentivized to do that thing?
Look, I think the problem is in exactly the way that you phrase it. If it is forcing it to be open, it's clear by now the US doesn't have that capacity. If it could potentially, if it invaded Iran and took over all of southern Iran, that would require 500,000 troops in a year of planning and logistical preparation. And I can tell you right now, the American public is not even willing to fight this air war over the Strait of Hormuz. The idea that they would actually be willing to put 500,000 troops into the ground, there's just no political pathway to that point. So I think reality, there's no way of forcing it open. There is a way to force to get it open through a diplomatic deal, but it requires a full commitment to that diplomatic deal, which I don't think is exactly what we saw with the MOU. Yes. And it requires compromises from both sides, the Iranians, and you have to keep in mind as well, closing the strait in the long run is also to Iran's detriment. Iran needs this strait open more than almost anyone else at the end of the day. So I think at the end of the day, I do see a pathway towards opening it. The question, how long will it take? And will it be a stable situation? And the only way to achieve that is through real diplomacy.
The MOU that was signed 2 months ago, earlier in the summer, why did that break? There's conflicting arguments from both sides. The Americans say that the MOU in itself was vague and the terms and agreements were never strictly ironclad. The Iranians said Lebanon was bombed by Israel and that broke the ceasefire immediately. So what actually happened? Why didn't we have the ceasefire maintained?
There's a couple of reasons, and both sides, of course, have their own narratives, and both of them have legitimate complaints about the other side. One thing that did happen is that the U.S. side was, throughout this period, despite the MOU, trying to create a southern corridor through Omani waters that would be fortified and that the Iranians would have an increasingly difficult time closing, even if war were to break out. At the same time, the U.S. signs an MOU in which the question of the strait was supposed to be resolved through the MOU. But it still pursued this other pathway outside of the MOU, and that created tension. The Iranians started shooting at those ships that were not reporting or notifying the Iranians about their travel. They were turning off their transponders. I think that is an exaggerated reaction from the Iranian side. The US side said this is unacceptable, and they started shooting at the Iranians for shooting at the ships. 13 days later, the US stopped shooting, having achieved nothing. We still have a scenario in which the Iranians are shooting at the ships without any American response. I think the main conclusion of all of this is, A, the MOU was too vague, and the two sides were too quick to go to some form of kinetic force over disputes over this. I mean, in a lot of other agreements, you have some sort of a third party that is going to be the arbiter, that is going to be the entity that ensures that compliance is there. So, for instance, in the Iran nuclear deal, the IAEA played that role, the International Atomic Energy Agency. The MOU didn't have any such thing. So as soon as there was a dispute, the whole thing just collapsed.
I know we got limited time here, so I want to take it into a few different directions. I want to talk about the Asian side, and I want to talk about Israel. There's an election coming up in October. So China, what is China's role in this war right now? It's been speculated that China has been kind of America's ironic angel because they stopped importing oil. At least they cut their oil imports dramatically. And that alone, that and added to the fact that they've been using their own reserves, helped maintain a rather affordable oil price. People speculated oil would go to $150 to $200, but China stepped in and prevented that from happening. Can you comment on whether or not China made a deal with the U.S. to your understanding, or why what China wants from this situation.
So I have no indication that there was any deal between the US and China. I think China just did what China does. China follows its own interest. And when you have this dramatic situation in which stability of exports out of the Persian Gulf has been compromised, the Chinese immediately react by shifting to other sources. They have a very large strategic reserve. They dipped into that, but they also realized that the long-term stability of the Persian Gulf now is a question mark. And as a result, they acted proactively to reduce their dependence on the Persian Gulf. It's not going to be eliminated, of course, but they're going to reduce it. They're going to balance it out. They're going to invest in green technology and other things. Now there's indications that they're going to start importing more oil from Iran because they need to rebuild their strategic reserve. And they have a very large one. The US also has a very large one. Secondly, they did not come in on Iran's side in this conflict, nor did they come in on the American side. And when they could, behind the scenes, they did help play a diplomatic role to get this conflict to be over. And as a result, they did not try to exasperate this conflict in order to hurt the United States. One would have thought, if one were to listen to all the China hawks in Washington, that the Chinese would have taken advantage of this conflict to further destroy American credibility or to bog the US down in the region. I've not seen any evidence of that whatsoever. Perhaps they don't need to do anything because the US did this to itself. The Chinese are just pursuing their own interests, and their own interest is, frankly, to stay out of these conflicts and make sure that they don't get dragged into other countries' disputes, something that I wish the US had a stronger capability of doing. I think we have quite the opposite problem. And right now, I think the Chinese are sitting tight. They're hoping that there will be some sort of resolution, but I suspect that over the long time, they're going to have a long-term project of reducing their dependency on the Persian Gulf.
At what point does America's allies in Asia start putting tremendous pressure on the US and Trump to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? Take Japan, for example, right? Japan, I think 95 to 97% of Japan's oil comes from the Middle East. Now, either they divert that to another source, or they need to force the Strait of Hormuz to open because most of the oil that they get flows through the Strait of Hormuz. At what point do the Asians come together and say, hey, look, we're your allies. You need to fix this right now, Trump, or all hell's going to break loose in Asia?
So I think there's been some of those conversations already. You saw some of the private conversations that were held at the ASEAN summit with Marco Rubio. And I think the message privately by many of these Asian countries was to express a profound frustration that Trump had started this war in the first place and that they were still not fixing the issue of the Strait, because Asia is hit, as you pointed out, so much harder by this than the US is itself. The US is remarkably insulated from the consequences of this. That's not to say that the US economy is not suffering or that gas prices are not higher, but higher gas prices is very different from fuel shortage, which is what many Asian countries have now suffered from, which is a much, much worse situation. Mm-hmm. And that frustration runs very deep. But I think we also have to be very clear. If the United States cannot force it open militarily, there's no other country in the region or in Asia, save China perhaps, that could. So their only option is to push Trump to become more flexible in the diplomacy. And part of the problem is not necessarily just a lack of flexibility from both sides. It's just a lack of profound trust. And on the American side, I would say Trump is not the type of a person that has the right level of patience that is required to fully negotiate a deal like this. He wants to see immediate results, instantaneous. And that's just not going to work. And I think he gets frustrated far too quickly, and then he lashes out far too quickly.
Several times this year, like I mentioned, ceasefires have been broken because Iran blames Israel for bombing Lebanon. What is Israel's endgame with Lebanon? That seems to be the thorn in the ceasefire issues over the past couple of months. Is it just to disarm Hezbollah, or is there a broader picture here?
Well, first of all, I think the Israelis, when it comes to Lebanon, their broader aim is not to just disarm. They have made it very clear that they want to annex certain parts of southern Lebanon. They are currently annexing parts of Syria. They're expanding their control over Palestinian territories. These are not conspiracy theories. These are not radical elements, fringe elements outside of government. These are statements coming from cabinet members in Israel. So I think the idea that they're just looking for the disarmament of Hezbollah is highly unconvincing. And their longer term objective with the war is that they want the United States to continue this war as long as possible in order to weaken Iran as much as possible, which puts their interests, or at least how they define their interests, completely in contradiction to the interests of essentially the rest of the world, because everyone else is suffering tremendously from this. The Israelis are not. And they think that it would be much worse for them if the US prematurely ends the war. And they were very, very upset about the MOU. And I think they were quite content that it has collapsed. And I would say that as soon as the issue of the Strait is resolved, the next crisis is going to be Lebanon, because that's when the focus is going to shift to whether what is happening in Lebanon right now is in accordance with the MOU. And if there is going to be a straight return to the MOU, or if the US and Iran wants to renegotiate this issue.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, Trita. Tell us what the major developments or political, events in the next couple of months are that will probably move this war in one way or another. So there's a U.S. midterm election. There's also an election in Israel in October. These two are key. What can we expect from the Israeli election? What can we expect from the American midterms? And are there other events that you're watching?
Well, I don't think that you will see profound policy changes if a different government comes into office in Israel. You will have a different prime minister, and his skills in terms of dealing with Washington may be different from that of Netanyahu, but I don't see profound changes in terms of the direction Israel will go. Many of the people who are now challenging Trump, or Netanyahu,
but I've read, I've read the Israelis are not, a lot of Israelis polled are not supportive of this war. Is that correct or no?
I've not seen any polls that say that they're not in support of the war. I think I've seen plenty of polls that say that this war was not a victory, whereas they do believe that the previous war was a victory. I've not seen any polls that say that they're now turning on the war, at least not in significant numbers. But the challenges to Netanyahu are primarily coming from the right. People who are accusing him of not having won the Iran war, not having done enough, not having taken on Hezbollah more effectively, etc. So I think it would be a bit naive to expect that suddenly there's going to be a shift in the Israeli direction that would be easier for Washington to deal with.
Last question. When will this war end, and how, if we were to speculate?
It will end through some form of a negotiation. I think that is a certainty. Even if there's another round of war, all these wars will have to end through some sort of a negotiation. The question of when is very difficult to tell, but I would suspect that this is going to be a somewhat active conflict, at least till the midterms.
Okay. Thank you very much, Trita. Tell us where we can follow you.
You can go to Substack, which is tritaparsi.substack.com, Twitter, which is tparsi, or go to the Quincy Institute's website, quincyinst.org.
We'll put the links down below, so make sure to follow Trita's work there. Thank you very much, Trita. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe.